I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. Firefighters Union President Chris Steele, a disruptive political force like few others in San Antonio's recent history, for all his impact, remains an enigma, one that today we're going to learn more about in an effort to better understand the 3 charter amendments coming up on the November ballot. And to do that, I'm joined now once again by San Antonio Express News staff writer Bruce Selcraig. So Bruce, great to have you back here on the podcast again. You know, ever since the San Antonio Professional Firefighters Association started that signature drive to get these 3 petitions on the ballot, Chris Steele has been in and out of the headlines. But Bruce, what I'd like to start with is the time before all that. Could we begin by talking about Chris Steele's past and how he went on to become the president of the Firefighters Union to push for these amendments?
Well, he started, as you might imagine, as a young firefighter. In fact, even before then, he was a detention officer in Bexar County. That means he worked in the jail and apparently did that very briefly. I guess I should even back up further. He was born in Germany. He's an Army brat. Chris says he came to San Antonio in the 3rd grade. He went on to Roosevelt High School, where he was in the National Honor Society, the Color Guard, Civil Air Patrol, ROTC, things like that. And then he goes on to the brief jail job and apparently hears about the fire department and how that's a good job and they have good benefits and that sort of thing. So he goes through the training. He didn't get stellar marks in the training academy. One of his supervisors said he basically stands around, and if you haven't given him a direct order, he doesn't really know what to do. But you know how that can be. Supervisors sometimes just don't like particular trainees, and I gave Chris a chance to respond to that specific evaluation that he got, and he did not reply. Throughout my story, Chris Steele didn't reply to dozens of questions. We had a brief conversation earlier in September and didn't get much covered, but he said a few things in that conversation. And then he said, I will talk with my executive membership, my circle, his sort of inner circle, to decide whether we will cooperate further with this story. And then he let me know that they had told him that we don't want you to cooperate any further with interviews. So from that point onward, he ignored text messages, phone calls, emails, everything. So we gave him a chance. But anyway, to get back to the chronology there. So he joins the fire department and works his way up from engineer to lieutenant to captain to eventually a district chief. And at that point, as a district chief, he runs against a union president by the name of John Anderson, and he defeats Anderson, and we are told defeats Anderson with the support of a right-leaning sort of Tea Party, Trump kind of attitudinal side of the fire department. So that was sort of his support base for that first victory. And he has won 6 elections since then and has served almost 15 years, and that is by far the longest of any union president in the history of the firefighters union.
So, Bruce, as you mentioned, maybe not the greatest beginning when it comes to being a San Antonio firefighter, but the most successful union president, as you just pointed out. That's quite a rise to the top. Before we move on and talk about, to be honest, some controversy that's been surrounding Chris Steele over the past several weeks and months, let's quickly tackle these three charter amendments and what they will do if they're passed in November.
Well, for the reader who is not intimately familiar with this, the campaign for these charter amendments was started by the firefighters union, and it is widely seen as payback for the city manager's tough bargaining position. And so, and that seems credible. I don't know anyone who disputes that, and I don't think the fire union does. But they present these three amendments as just good democracy, good common sense democracy, and kind of a populist approach. One of the amendments would limit the city manager's salary to 10 times that of the lowest paid full-time employee. I believe that's the way it's worded. And also put term limits. It would not affect the current city manager, Cheryl Scully. Another amendment would lower the bar on the number of signatures that are required to affect an amendment. And the third one is an amendment that would allow the firefighters in their negotiations over their contracts to declare an impasse and get arbitration. This doesn't apply to police, doesn't apply to anybody else, just the firefighters. So that's kind of curious. That's a unique wrinkle, and I've asked people around the state. Most people don't know of a similar charter amendment in any other major city.
So we've got the rise of Chris Steele now at the top of the San Antonio Professional Firefighters Union, moving on with these three amendments that may or may not pass on the November ballot. Let's talk about some other issues surrounding all this that have been, on the front pages of the San Antonio Express News and just kind of anywhere else that's covering Alamo City news, because these have obviously been very important developments. That all being the case, it's kind of weird to talk about this first one. There was a controversy about clothing. Tell me about that.
Well, Chris Steele had how shall we call it? It wasn't purely a press conference, but on September 20th at the Democratic headquarters in San Antonio, there was sort of a dubious press conference where some Democrats announced their support for the charter amendments, and then they called on Chris Steele to speak for a moment. And at this press conference, Chris Steele was in a nice starched white long sleeve shirt with a patch on the shoulder and a badge on the front. And unless you got right up to it and looked at the exact wording, you would think he's in his official city uniform. And that's precisely what it was designed to look like. But turns out those aren't authentic patches, and they were patches that he had fashion, and they just have slight wording changes so that they aren't exactly mimicking an actual uniform. And it turns out he got reprimanded for that. It's against regulations to wear your uniform to any sort of political event, not just to speak at the event, but to be present at the event if you're not on duty. That's my understanding. And so he was reprimanded by the fire department chief, Charles Hood, who said, in essence, it's obvious he went to some deliberate efforts to confuse the public.
So that's number one. We have at least a few more to go through. There are now 2 audio recordings of Chris Steele from the recent past. Tell me about those.
There was a tape recording made by a firefighter, and it's an anonymous source, and so we won't go into that. But the gist of the recording is Chris Steele telling X number of people, I don't know how many were in the crowd at the moment, but telling firefighters that City Councilman Greg Brockhouse is their man, and they are completely behind him for his assumed race to be mayor in 2020. And that was a revelation of sorts, because though people could logically assume that and piece that together, no one had said that publicly, and the fire union had very carefully nurtured this image of how our entire campaign is all about altruism, and it's all about how we care about the city and care about the citizens and their ability to take back City Hall and that sort of thing. That has been the approach. And then to hear the fire union chief so nakedly and boldly say, this is about good old-fashioned politics. We want to get our guy in, and Greg Brockhouse loves our union, loves the firefighters, and he will grease the skids for our way of seeing this issue. And the very clear message is we will not negotiate on our contract. They haven't had a contract for 5 years. We're not going to come to the bargaining table. We're going to put everything off until the 2020 mayoral and hope that we win.
Hey, this is what's going on. And so it's really a campaign tactic, but it's also a lobbying tactic to get city council to back up in 3 things. So everything we're doing here, the strategic objective is to get us a contract within the next year. The tactical objective is get the city to drop the lawsuit. Get the city to negotiate fairly, because at the end of this, when we go to the table, they can do like they did in mediation. They can just jack us around. What they did in mediation, and what you saw, let me get the third thing. The third thing is set it up to where May of 2019, we can put our own guy in the mayor's office, which would be Greg Brockhouse in the mayor's office.
And that, of course, was the full audio of the first of 2 clips that are now in existence from the recent past of, as you mentioned, Bruce, Chris Steele talking to firefighters about what appear to be different motives for this push to have these 3 charter amendments on the November ballot. And now, if you're a firefighter in support of this, hopefully pass. And then if you're in opposition, obviously, that's not something that you want to have. So that, those recordings obviously complicate this even more, as well as the uniform controversy that we've talked about. But there's another big piece of this. There was supposed to be a debate between Chris Steele and the mayor that the San Antonio Express News was involved with. There has been differing accounts, depending on who you talk to, about what exactly happened. But the line that I've been hearing from everyone at the newspaper is that this was confirmed. Chris Steele and the mayor, Ron Nierenberg, and then Chris Steele pulled out. Tell me about that event.
Well, apparently, and I say that only because there's no one who's really compiled any official version, but apparently Chris Steele agreed to this debate some weeks prior to that date, which was September 20th, the same date as that press conference at the Democratic headquarters that I referred to. So he agreed to this weeks before, and then some 2 hours before, on that day, September 20th, he cancels. So obviously that inconveniences hundreds of people who planned on attending, including students, supporters, firefighters, friends, everybody who wasn't in on the inner circle who presumably heard about his cancellation. So the reason this is significant, of course, is that it kind of fits a pattern, especially a recent pattern, of Chris Steele backing out of public events or press conferences or interviews where he doesn't control the script. There was a lot of pushback on this particular event, on the September 20th debate at UTSA, that this really made Steele look like someone who is reticent to debate Ron Nierenberg or anyone with the city when it's essentially one-on-one, and it would be open to questions and not an easy way to manipulate the questions or the audience. And it really didn't look good for Chris. The people I spoke with, political consultants, for example, one of the people I spoke with, a consultant by the name of C.J. Connolly, he doesn't represent either side in this charter amendment fight. He said very simply, just as clearly as anyone has said in this whole fight, he said, this is about Chris Steele's ego. He needs to get his ego out of this issue. People are talking about Chris Steele instead of talking about the issues, instead of talking about the 3 amendments and talking about dollars and cents and what binding arbitration means and all of that. People aren't talking about that. They're talking about Chris Steele. It's become a personality debate and is usually framed as Chris Steele versus Cheryl Scully, who is the city manager for San Antonio. And so that was this political consultant's view, but apparently he wasn't far off base, because soon after that September 20th debacle for Steele, his executive committee has a meeting, and we are told that they took a formal vote and in no uncertain terms told him to take a step back, that we want you to be in the background from now on until the election, and other people will speak for the union and other people will be offered up to be interviewed. And that may or may not be happening, but we sense that Steele has not cooperated with our newspaper in most cases for any further interviews. But even with others, even with radio and TV stations, we think Steele is taking a back seat for the moment. We'll see if that lasts until November 6th. But that would seem to be a good strategy in some people's minds. I think some people said after the September 20th pullout in the debate that may have been the watershed moment where some people in San Antonio who would normally be very pro-union and very supportive of the firefighters, that they looked at this differently and began to start exploring who Steele is and what this amendment campaign is about. And no one has polling numbers immediately before and after that debacle on September 20th. But I think that sounds logical to me, that that's what was going on. One of the most intriguing elements of this entire affair is the political difficulties for progressive Democrats on the city council. Now, no one runs under Republican or Democrat on the city council, because in Texas, the mayoral races and city councils are to be nonpartisan. But that's all with a wink and a nod, of course, and we know everybody's affiliation, more or less, on the city council. So here's what the situation is, and this is really fascinating for political junkies. There are many progressive Democrats on the San Antonio City Council who, for their entire political careers, have depended upon the support of labor unions. And I don't mean all their support or even most, but they ideologically agree with labor unions, and they love their support and the physical support from their workers, walking blocks and getting out the vote. Well, now they're put in this very awkward position of having to tell their constituents, no, these amendments are pushed by the fire union, and this isn't a union like you think it is. This is not the garment workers in El Paso. This is not the textile workers in North Carolina fighting to get a $9 an hour minimum wage. These are people who are making $145,000 a year with benefits. They have a wonderful contract. They won't come to the table, and this is all about ego, and you need to vote against these amendments. And yes, we're asking you to reject this fire department union. And that's a tough sell. And I've interviewed these city council members, and they say, you bet that is a tough sell. I'm talking to people who I've been asking for money from and things like that as a city council member for 20, 30 years. And I'm asking people to essentially vote against the union's wishes. And that's not an easy sell.
And a big thanks to San Antonio Express News staff writer Bruce Selcraig for that very, very in-depth look at the San Antonio Professional Firefighters Union President Chris Steele. That all on today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.